So I was at my friend Cooper's apartment the other night. We had plans to play Half-Life Alyx and finish our playthrough and also sip on some hard Mountain Dew that he had smuggled in from Minnesota. Can't buy it in New York yet. So I've had this theory about video games kicking around in my brain for a while, and so I decided to test it out on him. So I asked, hey man, do you think video games are harder now? He asked for some clarification. I can't totally be sure because we'd switched to whiskey at that point, but anyway, I clarified. I said, multiplayer games, right? And he said immediately he said, yes. I think that's kind of fascinating, because I think that multiplayer games are harder now too. This is my theory, right? Hopefully, by the end of this video, I can convince you to think the same way. Also, I'm out for a walk. It's really nice out. It makes me depressed about the future of our planet, but hey, you gotta enjoy the warm weather while it lasts, I think. Anyway, I'll see you in my room. Testing audio? Yes. Yes, audio, yes.
3, 2, 1, rolling.
And we just sit. We wait. Let's see. Gotta make sure everything's tucked in. On my best days, I like to think that I am okay at video games. That said, I feel like that's kind of become harder to believe lately. Every time I log on to Valorant or whatever with the boys, it feels like every 12-year-old Timmy with a Slick Deals headset can clap my cheeks with ease and alacrity. The power of youth! Anyway, I'm like 80% sure that I'm not alone in feeling this way. I'm not alone in feeling that something has changed since I was a young gamer. Something that's not my age, I mean. Anyway, I have a theory for you, my adult gaming peers. Things have, in fact, changed since you started gaming. Everyone is better now, and it is harder to keep up if you, like me, work a job and pay taxes and stuff. So, let's get into it. In the beginning, there was MUD. Multi-user dungeons. These were text-based role-playing games that you could play with other people. First locally, and then, a little later, with anyone in the world. They were most popular in the 80s and early 90s, but they're absolutely still around today. By the mid-90s, internet connections had improved enough to birth the beginnings of the multiplayer scene as we know it today. In 1996, id Software released Quake World, the multiplayer-only version of the first-person arena shooter Quake, which was an instant hit. The next year, Ultima Online came out, which was the first massively multiplayer online game. Anyway, to fast forward through a bunch of history, as computer performance improved and internet speeds increased, more games were created that could take advantage of those two facts. And as the prices for hardware and infrastructure decreased, more people began playing online games. Warcraft, Counter-Strike, Rainbow Six, etc. You get it, you've played them. I think a turning point in this particular story was the release of the original Xbox in 2001. It shipped with an internal hard drive and an Ethernet port. Microsoft had bet the future of its gaming division on the idea that people would want to play with each other.
Oh, you're gonna blow up the TV.
Xbox Live came out the next fall, and Xbox Live was a game changer. At the same time, it felt like the gaming landscape had kind of bifurcated. There were consoles and there were PCs. It was almost like two different worlds of gaming. While PC players could play with each other in private servers and in custom lobbies, playing online with a console wasn't yet widespread. You have to remember, this was the age of couch co-op. But Xbox Live finally made it easy for console players to get online. Around the same time, gaming kind of went mainstream.
Behind the Jeep! I'm out! I need ammo! America's most legendary infantry unit. And though every man was different, they fought as one. Big Red 1. Call of Duty 2 Big Red 1, rated T for teen.
More importantly for our purposes, however, is the year 2007. I'd go so far as to call it the year of broadband. According to the researchers at Pew, a full 70% of people who used the internet at home in 2007 were on a broadband connection. So more people than ever were playing online games, on connections that were faster than ever, on hardware that was relatively accessible, if not especially cheap. Online gaming had finally begun to mature. I was a teenager in the Xbox 360 years. I distinctly remember when Halo 3 was released in 2007, because it was a huge deal for me and my brother. We spent hours playing multiplayer with our friends, and then, after they'd leave our house, we'd swap off the controller and play with random people on Xbox Live. It felt thrilling, kind of like I was browsing an esoteric forum, but everything was happening in real time, and every post was a headshot. But the most important thing for me was finally starting to understand how big gaming actually was. It felt like I had gained a dim awareness of the outside world, and that looked like a place where people were way better at the games I was playing than I was. I didn't know how to get there, or really how to see that world, but knowing it was there was enough. I was sometimes better than my friends, but I finally knew there were people out there who were way, way better than all of us. One of those people is the streamer Nick Kolcheff, who goes by Nick Mercs online. In the spring of 2021, I talked to Nick about that era of gaming for a profile of him I wrote at The Verge. Around that time, he'd been quickly climbing the rankings of the site GameBattles.com, which also had a sophisticated tournament organizing system. Nick told me that he and his teammates began to make thousands of dollars competing around the country in tournaments. Although, as he took pains to emphasize, travel and accommodation took a huge chunk out of any cash they actually made. Even so, the gaming scene wasn't totally professionalized yet. There wasn't a path forward really beyond whatever you could make competing in tournaments. It really worried Nick's parents. Once, his mom went so far as to smash his Xbox on their front lawn. She was afraid of attitude. She was afraid of failure. And listen, I was a tough kid to raise, man. Imagine trying to raise a kid that loves something so much that isn't there yet. Like, gaming was not there yet. So they were just trying to be good parents. They were doing the right thing. And he's right. There wasn't a path to a stable living playing games, at least not yet. So my life turned out a bit differently than his. I say that also because I think we're just about the same age, which is, fun fact, just about the same age as the internet itself. Anyway, my gaming career hasn't been particularly illustrious, but I think it's also been mostly typical, which is what I want to emphasize here. So I gamed with friends and on Xbox Live until I went to college, when I quit until my senior year because I suspected if I didn't stop, I'd never graduate. So, in case you were worried, I did in fact manage to graduate. On time, too. Anyway, when I returned to gaming a few years later, the first thing I realized was that my skills had atrophied. Like, it was a muscle and I didn't use it, so I lost it. The second thing I realized was that everyone had leveled up. Like, it kind of felt like the world had gone from casual to tryhard while I wasn't looking. While I was away, the wider gaming world had also gone through a dramatic transformation. Things had professionalized. Suddenly there were streamers, like Nick, for example, who showed off their high-level gameplay to a live audience of thousands. There were YouTubers who spent time figuring out and then explaining optimal playing strats. Meanwhile, it seemed like the best players of every game had become quasi-gurus in their own right. The biggest thing I noticed was that there was finally money in gaming. You could make a career by defining the best ways to play a video game. You could buy a house, maybe even start a family. Downstream from that, where I was, the people I was playing against kept getting better. The lobbies were tougher. That other world I was talking about earlier felt more clearly visible than ever. I had been thinking about all this stuff, the stuff I just told you, for a few weeks when I saw that Dan Olson had uploaded a new video titled Why It's Rude to Suck at Warcraft. I'm going to summarize some of the main points here, but do yourself a favor and watch the whole video because I think it's amazing. Basically, Dan and his co-host in the video, Nathan Landel, give a capsule history of World of Warcraft, and they explain how the game got to the state it's in today. They investigate and explain, and then they point to the thing that's changed the game the most: the paratext.
The concept of paratext was originally conceived by French literary theorist Gérard Genette. Genette saw a book as containing the text of the book, the primary work, but also containing other components that were necessary for the book to be complete, but that were not an element of the primary text.
Like they said, in the context of gaming, paratext is all the other stuff that surrounds a video game that isn't explicitly part of the game itself. So, as Olson and Landel go on to explain, in World of Warcraft, that's third-party add-ons like weak auras. What I'm interested in is generalizing their theory a little bit. I think the culture of online gaming has fundamentally changed the way we game because we as consumers now have full and free access to the production of elite knowledge. The corollary to that, there are now socially prescribed ways of playing online video games downstream of that elite knowledge. There's an assumption, in other words, that the people you're playing with know the unspoken rules of the game you're playing. And I think that this happens in every single game. The paratext of a game is the culture and practices that are socially produced around the game, right? For other online games, shooters, say, or fighting games, the paratext helps create the metagame, the game that you play while you're playing a video game. You know, the meta. I should say here that metagame is kind of a fraught term. I mean that in the academic sense. There are a few different understandings of what a metagame actually is, and we'll get into some of them. But everyone agrees with the origin. It's Greek. Meta, meaning a thing about a thing, and game, meaning, well, game. The term's history, on the other hand, has to do with the Cold War. Feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter if you already know your history and you just want to get into the metagame's relevance to video games. Metagaming as a concept came into use during the Cold War because of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which is a pretty basic idea. Essentially, if the Soviet Union launched its nuclear weapons at the US, America would launch its arsenal as well. That, of course, would mean the end of the world as we know it. Because most people don't actually want the apocalypse to happen, the theory goes, neither party will launch their nukes. Destruction, mutually assured. The oldest way to model this state of affairs is a thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma. The mathematician Albert Tucker came up with it in 1950, and it goes like this. Two prisoners have been caught committing the same crime. They're arrested and held separately. They're then offered the choice to betray each other. Their decision will have one of three outcomes. First, if one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who confesses will be given a reward, while the other will be fined. 2. If both of them confess, they'll both be fined. 3. If neither of them confesses, they'll both be freed. The prisoners can't talk to each other, and we're assuming there's no honor among thieves either, so there's not necessarily an incentive to cooperate. So, if you model all this mathematically, with both prisoners incentivized to pay as little as possible, you end up at the second outcome. Both confess, and both are punished. Now, if you substitute confess with launch warhead, you can see why we still remember the thought experiment. By now, I'm sure you can see the problems with this approach. Like, what if the prisoners were friends before their crime? And what if they planned it out together? What if they did, in fact, discuss the possibility of being caught and interrogated separately? What if there are more to the scenario? In 1971, a man named Nigel Howard laid out an alternative attempt to solve the prisoner's dilemma based on a non-quantitative and non-rational approach using the theory of metagames. The goal of the work was to produce a technique that could be used to solve real-life, real-time conflict. To quote Stephanie Bullock and Patrick Lemieux, authors of the brilliant book Metagaming, this is what happens next.
Whereas in the original dilemma, there are only two options, to confess C or to not confess D. According to Howard's metagame theory, player 1 can also make additional, extensive choices based on player 2's possible actions. By projecting an opponent's potential behavior, the simple decision to confess or not exponentially multiplies into 4 new meta choices. Confess if they confess, don't confess if they don't confess if they don't confess, and don't confess if they confess. A game theory within a game theory.
And then player 2 can do the same thing. Model more meta choices based on the choices they think player 1 might have made. It ends up an infinitely branching tree of possible choices. But when you cross-reference player 1's meta choices and player 2's meta choices, you find points of equilibrium, stability, maybe even rational solutions to the problems of mutually assured destruction, like, say, nuclear disarmament. Now, let's talk about metagames in terms of video games. As I mentioned earlier, academics have a few different understandings of the term. So, we can broadly say metagames are games about games. But that can mean games that are specifically about games, like the academic Ian Bogost game Cow Clicker, which was a satire of Facebook games. Or, say, the things outside of games that we bring into them, like the distinction between character and player knowledge in Dungeons & Dragons. Another famous definition comes from Richard Garfield, who's the guy who created Magic the Gathering. According to a column he published in The Duelist, which is a defunct trading card game magazine from Wizards of the Coast, Garfield had a major realization about metagames when he was 16.
When you play a number of games, not as ends unto themselves, but as parts of a larger game, you are participating in a metagame. Take chess as an example. When you think of chess, you usually think of a single game or match against a single opponent. To a chess player in a competition, however, each game is a small part of a bigger game.
Later, in Magic, Garfield literalized the metagame by introducing the Scheherazade card, which, when played, forces players to leave the game in progress and use the cards left in their library to play a sub-game of Magic. Afterwards, players shuffle those cards, return them to their library, and resume the game in progress, with the loser of the sub-game having their remaining life points. Naturally, this card has been widely banned in competitive play. For our purposes, the definition of metagame we're going to use is close to Garfield's. It was formalized in a paper published in the International Journal of Esports, which, if you didn't know, is a peer-reviewed open-access journal about research in esports. Pretty cool if you ask me. Anyway, the paper was titled Metagaming and Metagames in Esports. In their introduction, the authors write that those other definitions that I mentioned earlier overload the term metagame with meaning. They argue it makes the term opaque to researchers. In esports specifically, they write, the metagame has come to mean the perceived, quote, optimal or dominant playing strategies that are the most popular. To further quote the paper,
metagaming, in the context of esports, is ultimately about selecting or creating an optimal playing strategy using means outside of the game itself to affect the outcome of a game. This requires strategizing, and is directly linked to higher-level decision-making as influenced by one's understanding of an esport, which in turn is mediated by one's performance, knowledge, and innate biases about how the game is meant to be played, and how their opponents in turn will behave. Metagaming is dynamic, and the strategies that are created are never in isolation, but rather they are part of a shifting ecosystem of highly public competitive play.
Highly public competitive play. Remember that. It's this context that I think is key to understanding why multiplayer online games are different and harder now. We're playing them in the context of esports, which means the production of elite knowledge, the paratext, can act inside the games you play. Those optimal strategies are now just what you have to do to keep up. When I started gaming again, on a secondhand PS4 I bought off a friend, I had just gotten really into Fortnite. The Battle Royale, not the base building version. Anyway, from what I recall of those early days, gameplay felt intense. Fortnite is a Battle Royale game, meaning that it takes its central play mechanic from the 2000 film Battle Royale, which was itself based on a novel from the year before, but that's not important to this particular story. Anyway, in every battle royale, the idea is that the last person or team standing wins. The playable area shrinks over time, which forces confrontations among competitors. Dying means you're out, and the film is a gruesome classic for that specific reason. In games, on the other hand, you respawn in the lobby and you have to load into another match. Fortnite's twist on the formula, the thing that launched it into mainstream success, was its building mechanic. Nearly everything on the map, from the trees to the cars to the houses, is destructible, and you get raw materials for their destruction. You use those materials to build one of 4 pieces: walls, ramps, floors, and cones. The ability to build your own cover made the game very, very different from your average shooter. Originally, people used the building mechanic in a traditional kind of way, like you put up some cover and you hide behind it. Maybe you'd build a box or a fort and use it like you'd use a building in a more traditional shooter. That changed in 2019 when Kyle Giersdorf, who's better known as Booga, won the inaugural Fortnite World Cup and came away $3 million richer. The event showed off what high-level Fortnite looked like, which was very, very different from what me and my friends saw on the island every day. The competitors built these massive towers in the blink of an eye. They edited through their walls and jumped into their opponents' boxes to shotgun them in the face. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. In the right hands, I realized that building had suddenly become a weapon. And then, months after the tournament ended, I began to see the same kind of building and editing and box fighting in my own games. So I started practicing those skills, because all of a sudden they'd become necessary to play the game. Like, if you didn't participate in the arms race, you were getting sent back to the lobby. It was either crank 90s or die. The conclusion that Dan Olson reaches in his World of Warcraft video is that instrumental play that's optimized to achieve a specific goal, is not necessarily great for a game's various communities, because it condenses play into something regimented. It assumes there's one objective, and that there are certain knowable steps you can take to reach that objective. Paratext turns online gaming into an arms race because of how it acts on a given game's metagame, in the esports sense. Recently, for a while, there was an exploit in Fortnite that allowed players to edit a ramp in a certain way and instantly gain a ton of height because of a glitch in how the game handles mantling. Which was a huge advantage, because in just about every shooter, having the high ground is pretty advantageous. I mean, it was hard to do, of course, but if you could do it, it was worth doing. Until the developers patched the bug, my various feeds were flooded with people showing off the exploit or making tutorials on how to do it. The paratext was being produced in real time, acting on the metagame, until the strategy was rendered unviable by the game's developers, who are the other part of this arms race. And the cycle continues. Players find new strategies, glitches, or bugs, and then they use that knowledge to make content for the wider community. A part of that community then uses those new techniques to play the game differently, and then the entire player base races to catch up to the new optimal strategy until the developers decide to upload a patch. And every game has this kind of knowledge attached to it. The same cycle plays out everywhere. And that's why I think games have gotten harder since Broadband and TikTok and YouTube. Knowledge about and around games is constantly being discovered and disseminated, and if you don't keep up, it feels like you get left behind. There's an entire industry that sustains itself by producing this kind of expert knowledge and passing it down to players. That creates an expectation for how people should play, which changes the community. It makes people sweatier, if you will, because it sucks to lose, especially if you start losing to people running the same set of strategies or weapons. And for the record, I do think skill-based matchmaking does kind of change your experience of this. If you're a higher skill player, small adjustments to the metagame can result in larger differences in outcome, right? Like, if winning a gunfight or exploiting an advantage comes down to milliseconds, you'll feel every minor balance change. And that means you'll probably adopt these new optimal strategies faster. Anyway, if you're like me, and you've just gotten off a long day at work, cracked a beer, and loaded up your game, all of this can sometimes feel like too much to deal with. Especially if you're playing COD and you have Timmys and Jimmys and Kyles screaming at you. One thing I haven't mentioned is fun. Learning how to perceive and then interact with the metagame is extremely satisfying because it happens as you improve. And improvement is fun, right? Suddenly you can do things you couldn't before. You get good, as it were. After a while, however, after you've gained some mastery, everything becomes a little bit more obvious. And as you rank up, either literally, like in any game with a ranking system, or implicitly, in any game with skill-based matchmaking, you begin to stick to optimal play. Because that's what helps you improve, which is what helps you win. And that's fun, right? But maybe you start to plateau. Or maybe the metagame begins to feel stale and predictable. In either case, you might find yourself bored. It sucks to die to the same combination of guns and riot shields in COD, or to play against the same number of crab tanks in Splatoon. Here's the part of the video where I give you some advice. If that starts to happen, if you feel bored and uninspired by the games you've got in your Steam library, maybe try playing off-meta? Hear me out. I think the constraints of the metagame can be fun, especially if you're deliberately playing against them. I think the pleasures of playing off-meta are the equal and opposite of the pleasures of learning a game. It's the ability to break the rules because you finally know them. And who knows? Maybe you'll find a new strat that absolutely kills. And then, maybe you can upload a video about it. And then maybe it'll get popular, and then maybe everyone will figure it out and start using it against you, and then maybe you'll get bored, and then maybe you'll start playing off meta, and then maybe you'll find a new strategy that absolutely kills. Anyway, I still play Fortnite and Valorant and PUBG and stuff. I still want to get better. And though it's easy to get caught up in feeling like I'm behind, or that I need to know the latest advantageous strat, lately I've been just trying to let it wash over me. To play the games I play for their own sake. I try to remember that online gaming is fun for me because I feel like there's just so few areas of life where progress can be measured so linearly. It's fun because of the people I play with, because of the adrenaline of a late night clutch, because of the satisfaction of doing small things perfectly. And I mean, like I said at the beginning, on my best days, I like to think that I'm okay. I'm here to have fun, you know? Sometimes I'm glad that gaming isn't my job. The meta is the meta. It'll be there. I'm gonna be gaming anyway. So many games. I remember we used to buy them just like the $20 section for the most part. Some of them were full price, like you can still see Armored Core 4 Answer, $60. Hell of a game. But yeah. Tales of Symphonia. Hell of a game. I do want to play some Gulin though, so let's fucking